In the Arizona Territory, spring of 1887, Dust Haven was a town that held its breath. Every street was a straight line of false fronts and hard edges, a place where whispers traveled faster than a horse could run, and every single face was remembered. Just beyond its single dusty street stretched the Hollander Ranch, a spread of land worked by a widow and her two daughters. Grace Hollander was 23, and she rose before the sun even thought about it. Her hands were scarred from rope and shovel, her back strong from shouldering burdens that weren't hers to carry. Folks didn't call her pretty, not in the way they used the word for her sister. But her horse, a roan mare named Juniper, trusted her more than any man, and under her watch the ranch ran true. Belle, just 21, was a different story altogether. She was like a mirror catching sunlight, turning heads when she walked through the churchyard or stepped into the general store. Her dark hair was a cascade of perfect ringlets, and her laugh could make a grown man forget his own name. Where Grace was invisible, Belle was seen too much. Their mother, Mrs. Hollander, reminded her daily that a pretty face was currency, something to be traded for security. And Sunday was the day for trade. The wagon wheels kicked up a cloud of ochre dust. Grace held the hymnals tight to her chest while Belle fussed with the ribbon at her collar, angling her face just right to catch the morning sun. Their mother held the reins, her lips a thin, hard line, her eyes already scanning the crowd, calculating which man might be worthy enough to greet her youngest. The churchyard was a hive of Sunday best. Ranchers, storekeepers, and cowhands, all washed clean for the Sabbath, and every hat tipped first toward Belle. "Morning, Miss Belle," two young cowboys called out, their grins too wide, too hopeful. She gave them a smile that was like scattering coins, a small, practiced charity. Grace followed in her shadow, unnoticed, the hymnals her only shield. Inside, the pastor's voice droned on over the creak of the pews. Grace sang low and steady, her alto true. Belle sang brighter, and not quite on key, but nobody seemed to mind. Mrs. Hollander wasn't listening to the sermon. She was watching the congregation like a banker watches his ledgers, tallying every single look cast in Belle's direction. And then the church door opened. A wave of silence rolled from the back of the sanctuary to the front. A tall figure stood framed in the harsh sunlight. Caleb Del Toro. The whispers about him were as plentiful as the dust on the plains. Some said he'd scouted for the army, a man they relied on but never fully trusted. Others said he'd learned his trade on trails too harsh for any map, deep in the southern deserts. But on one thing, everyone agreed. His Apache blood made him a man caught between two worlds, half respected, half feared, but absolutely impossible to ignore. He stepped inside, his movements silent and deliberate. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair brushed back from a weathered face. His coat was trail-worn, his boots coated in the dust of 1,000 miles. He sat in the back pew, alone, without a sound. Belle's eyes lit up, and her lashes fluttered down with an ease that was anything but natural. Grace kept her eyes fixed on her hymnal, but she felt his presence in the room like a coming storm. When the service ended, the townsfolk spilled out into the yard, gathering under the shade of the cottonwoods. Pies were set on tables. Coffee was poured. The usual Sunday buzz filled the air. But today, every conversation was held in a lower register. Every eye kept flicking toward the man in the back. Mrs. Hollander saw her chance. She steered Belle straight toward him, her face a mask of polite welcome. "Mr. Del Toro," she said, her voice bright and sharp, "welcome back to Dust Haven. We all remember your father's good name." Belle lowered her head, her smile perfectly measured. "It's an honor to see you return, sir." Caleb inclined his head, a small, formal gesture. But his gaze, dark and intense, didn't rest on Belle. It moved right past her, steady and unhurried, like a river current, until it found Grace. She was standing back from the crowd, still clutching the hymnals to her chest. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them looked away. Grace didn't smile. She didn't offer any coy words. She just met his gaze with the same quiet, unyielding firmness she gave to her work. And that's when everything changed. "Mrs. Hollander," Caleb said at last, his voice clear and carrying across the suddenly silent yard, "with your leave, I'd ask permission to court your eldest daughter." The world seemed to stop. Coffee cooled in midair. A fork scraped against a tin plate. the sound as loud as a gunshot. "Grace?" Mrs. Hollander asked, her voice thin, as if she'd misheard. "Grace," Caleb repeated. There was no doubt in his voice, only certainty. Belle's perfect smile wavered for a fraction of a second, then snapped back into place, a beautiful, fragile thing. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Surprise, speculation, a bit of pity for Belle, and a whole lot of curiosity about Grace. Grace simply inclined her head. "If that is your wish, Mr. Del Toro, I'll not stand against it." Mrs. Hollander, caught between raw shock and frantic calculation, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then you may call on her Wednesday evening." Caleb tipped his hat, his eyes leaving Grace only when good manners demanded it. He refused pie, spoke little, and left the yard with the same quiet intensity he'd arrived with. The wagon ride home was a long, tense silence. Belle twisted the ribbon on her dress, her voice soft, but with an edge like broken glass. "Perhaps he admires hard work. That suits you, Grace." Mrs. Hollander gripped the reins so tight her knuckles were white. "Your father wanted the best for you, Grace. I pray you know what best means." Grace just watched the prairie roll by. Father cared more for a gate that latched than for talk of best. That night she sat by her window, holding her father's old pocket watch. The hands were still, but its weight in her palm was true. She thought of Caleb Del Toro's steady gaze. He hadn't flattered her. He had simply spoken her name as if it were a fact. Dust Haven would talk. They would talk about the pretty sister being passed over for the plain one. But for the first time in her life, Grace felt no shame. For the first time, she had been truly seen. And Wednesday was coming, like an unopened trail stretching out into the vast, unknown Arizona sky. Wednesday came with a sunset that painted the mesas in shades of copper and blood. The Hollander house was already cloaked in shadow, a single lamp lit against the falling dusk. Grace had finished her chores, her hands smelling of leather and hay, when the knock came. It was a firm, solid sound. Mrs. Hollander smoothed her dress, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes, and opened the door. Belle was lingering in the parlor, a fresh ribbon in her hair, pretending to read a book. Caleb Del Toro stood on the porch, hat in hand. His dark hair was brushed back from his face, but his coat still carried the dust of a long ride. "Good evening, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Hollander, but his eyes, as always, went straight past her to find Grace. "Mr. Del Toro," Mrs. Hollander replied, her voice a tightrope walk between formality and confusion. "Please, come in." They sat in the stuffy parlor, the lamplight throwing long, dancing shadows on the walls. Belle began to play the piano, the notes soft and hesitant, as if her delicate hands were afraid to strike the keys with any real force. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression calm. She was waiting. Finally, Caleb spoke. His words were as plain and straight as a fence line. "Miss Hollander, Grace, I will not waste your time with pretty words. I do not come for a courtship of flowers and poems." The piano music faltered and then stopped completely. "I seek a marriage of steadiness," he continued, his gaze locked on Grace. "My land is wide and it is hard. I need a partner who can endure it. I offer my name, my house, and my respect. I do not offer tender promises. If that does not suit you, I will speak no further on the matter and take my leave." The room was so still you could hear the lamp wick hiss. Belle's fingers were frozen over the ivory keys. Mrs. Hollander's face was a mask of strained composure, her dreams of a grand match for one of her daughters crumbling into dust. Grace looked at Caleb, her eyes clear and unwavering. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "Comfort is not a promise made in any marriage, Mr. Del Toro. Respect is. If you offer it honestly, I will not turn from it." For the very first time, something flickered in Caleb's eyes. It might have been surprise. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then we understand each other." And just like that, it was done. The news hit Dust Haven like a flash flood. By Sunday, tongues were wagging from the church pews to the general store counter. Some folks shook their heads, convinced Caleb Del Toro had lost his mind. Others whispered their pity for poor Belle, the most beautiful girl in the territory, left standing in her sister's shadow. But the town, for all its gossip, accepted what it could not change. The mysterious Apache horseman had chosen Grace Hollander, and she had accepted him. The wedding was a quiet, stark affair. The church bell rang, but no ribbons were hung across the street. Grace wore a simple calico gown, pressed neat, a plain veil covering her shoulders. Caleb stood tall and unmoving in a dark coat, his boots polished more out of duty than celebration. The pastor's words seemed to echo in the empty spaces of the church. The vows were spoken, steady and without flourish. When they exchanged the simple rings, there was no cheer, only the sound of creaking pews as neighbors leaned in to whisper. On the church steps, Belle forced a smile so bright it hurt to look at, her hands clenched into fists inside her white gloves. Mrs. Hollander stood stiff as a board, her pride as thin and brittle as old parchment. Caleb offered his arm to Grace, and together they walked out into the harsh afternoon sun. The wagon carried them away from town, Silence their only passenger. Dust Haven shrank behind them until it was just a line of false fronts against the horizon. Ahead of them, stretching out into the vast emptiness, was the Blackthorn Ranch, the land Caleb's father had left him. The house rose up from the prairie, square and stern, its roof weathered, its windows like watchful eyes. The corral was empty but strong, and the land rolled on, all of it living under the shadow of Red Butte. "This is yours now, Grace," Caleb said as they pulled up to the house. His voice held no softness, no welcome, only a statement of fact. Inside, the house felt heavy but not warm. The furniture was polished but unwelcoming. Ledgers were stacked in neat columns on a large desk. It was a house built for function, not for comfort, a fortress against the world. Grace set her veil on a chair and walked the length of the rooms, her steps measured, as if she were taking stock of her future, a future that felt as empty as the house itself. That first night, she ate stew alone at the kitchen table. Caleb remained in his study, bent over maps and ledgers under the light of a single lamp. Their few words were strictly practical. "There's wood stacked at the north shed. The well draws strong. The cattle are branded with a blackthorn." To anyone else, the silence would have been cold, unbearable. But to Grace, it was a silence she understood. It was the silence of work, of endurance. It was the silence she had lived with her entire life. The days fell into a steady, unchanging rhythm. Grace woke with the dawn, tending the small stock, mending tack, and keeping the books. Caleb rode the boundaries of his vast land, his days spent checking water lines and dealing with neighbors. Their exchanges were brief, never cruel, but never tender. They were two people sharing a space, but not a life. And yet small things began to appear, like wildflowers pushing up through hard-packed earth. One morning, Grace found an extra blanket folded neatly on the porch rail, left there against the chill that seeped through her window at night. Another evening, a worn but treasured book, Pilgrim's Progress, lay on her chair by the fire. There was no note. She said nothing. She simply opened it, its pages softened by time, and knew who had left it there. One afternoon, she was reviewing the grazing ledgers. "The south pasture is wearing thin," she said, not looking up from the page. "We should move the herd to the high ground." Caleb, who had been cleaning a rifle, stopped. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for a long time. He didn't dismiss her words. He didn't question her judgment. He just gave a slow nod. "It's a sound plan." That was enough. Belle visited once in those first few weeks. She arrived like a splash of bright color in a black and white world, her ribbons vibrant, her smile sharp and fixed. "Sister," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she stepped into the cool, dark parlor. "I just had to come and see how you were faring out here all alone." Grace offered her tea, her movements calm and deliberate. Belle's eyes darted around the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the lack of any feminine touch. Her gaze lingered on Caleb as he crossed the room, his steps silent, his presence filling the space. She laughed a little too loudly at a plain remark he made, trying to catch his eye, to draw him into her light. But Caleb just nodded, gave a few plain answers, and then excused himself to check the corral. As Belle was leaving, her smile finally faltered. She leaned in close to Grace, her whisper like the hiss of a snake. "He will grow tired of this silence, you know. A man like that needs more than a housekeeper." You'll see. Grace simply closed the door behind her and went back to her work. One evening, as the sun bled red across the buttes, Caleb found her in the barn. She was bent over a broken saddle strap, her needle moving with a neat, steady rhythm. The dust motes dancing in the slanted light caught around her like a golden halo. "You men tack yourself," he said from the doorway. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of surprise. Grace pulled the thread tight. "It's better than letting it fall to pieces." Most women wouldn't take to such work. "I prefer things that hold together," she said, her eyes still on her task. Caleb said nothing more, but he stayed in the doorway, watching her, for longer than he should have. It was the first real crack in the stone wall he had built around himself, a tiny fissure, but it was there. In Dust Haven, the whispers continued. Some still pitied Belle, saying her great beauty had been wasted. Others shook their heads at Grace, wondering how long a cold, practical marriage like that could possibly last. But out on the Blackthorn land, far beyond the reach of gossip and speculation, two people were moving through their days in a quiet, unspoken accord. It wasn't love, not yet, but something was forming between them, something as steady and reliable as the long fence line stretching out across the wide, empty land. Summer descended on the territory like a hammer blow. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down from Red Butte, shimmering off the hard-pan desert floor like a sheet of broken glass. The cattle bawled at the bone-dry creek beds, and the fine red dust coated everything, until every man and woman looked as if they'd been carved from the land itself. Grace found her rhythm in the brutal heat. She did her hardest work in the cool hours of the morning, always spending time with Juniper. The roan mare had been her one true friend for years, a creature she had gentled herself from a wild colt. Juniper trusted her voice, her touch, without question. One sweltering Saturday, a call went out for someone to haul a wagon load of supplies from Dust Haven. Caleb was days out, riding the cattle line in the high pastures, so Grace offered to make the trip. She saddled Juniper herself, her experienced hands running along every strap, checking every buckle. Satisfied, she led the mare out into the glaring sun. The ride started steady enough, but a mile out of town, something went horribly wrong. A snake, maybe, or a rabbit bursting from the brush. Juniper shied hard, a sudden, violent sideways leap. The cinch, the wide strap holding the saddle in place, slipped. The entire saddle twisted under the mare's belly. Grace was thrown. She landed hard against a crop of jagged rocks, the impact jarring through her shoulder, stealing her breath. Juniper stumbled, her legs tangling, and went down with a sharp, terrible scream that echoed across the empty flats. By the time two hands from a neighboring ranch found them, it was too late. Juniper's leg was hanging at a sickening angle. The bone snapped clean through at the fetlock. Grace, ignoring the fire in her own shoulder, had her hand pressed to the mare's neck, her voice a low, steady whisper, despite the pain. "Easy, girl. Easy now." The men helped her to her feet, their faces grim, but the whispers had already started, carried on the hot wind. She didn't tie her cinch right. Careless. "A damn shame. That was a fine horse. Del Toro won't be happy about this. Not one bit." By evening, Dust Haven was buzzing with the news. At the Mercantile, the story had already twisted into something ugly. Grace Hollander, the plain sister, the one who was supposed to be so capable, had ruined her own horse through sheer neglect. Belle was there, standing near the counter, her bonnet tied just so, the picture of delicate concern. She didn't argue with the gossip. She didn't defend her sister. She just tilted her head, her expression a perfect blend of pity and sorrow. "Poor Grace," she sighed, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "She tries so hard, but she was never really suited to handling stock alone." The words were poison, and they spread fast. Back at the ranch, Grace refused to let anyone else tend to Juniper. Her arm was a blaze of agony, but she wrapped the mare's shattered leg with steady hands, her face set and determined. She washed the wound, bound it as best she could, her movements precise even through the haze of pain. Caleb stood in the doorway of the barn watching her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "You should rest," he said, his voice flat. "She needs me," Grace answered, not looking at him. His gaze lingered on the sweat beading on her brow, the dirt smudged on her torn sleeve. He gave a single sharp nod and then turned and walked away, saying nothing about the rumors that had already reached his ears, carried by a ranch hand sent to find him. Grace worked through the night, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows. She whispered to Juniper, stroking her neck, humming the old low hymns her father used to sing. Each hour was a lifetime, but under her steady hand, the mare slowly calmed. Days later, the truth finally came out, but not in the way anyone expected. A young boy from the ranch, a hand named Jeremiah, came forward. He confessed, his face pale with guilt, that he had been the one to saddle Juniper that morning. He'd been in a hurry, he'd tied the cinch poorly, and he'd been too scared to admit it. Fear had kept him silent, but his conscience had finally driven him to Caleb. That evening, Caleb found Grace in the barn. She was sitting on a stool beside the stall, her arm now in a rough sling, her face pale with exhaustion. Juniper was resting quietly, her breathing slow and even. The lantern light carved his face into sharp planes and angles. "It wasn't your fault," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "The boy, Jeremiah." He came forward. Grace looked up, her eyes steady, though shadowed with weariness. "You bore the blame for something that was never yours to carry," Caleb continued. "Dust Haven won't remember the boy's name," she said, her voice raspy. "They'll only remember mine." A long silence stretched between them, thick with the heat of the night and unspoken words. "I should have spoken sooner," Caleb admitted, his voice heavier than she'd ever heard it. "I heard the talk, and I let it stand." Grace's hand stroked the mare's mane, a slow, calming rhythm. "You don't owe me a defense." "I do," he said, and the word was sharp, definitive. "I chose you. Your name is my name now. When they strike at it, they strike at me." Grace searched his face, looking for pity, for anger, for anything she could recognize. But she found only the plain, hard truth of a man who had kept his words locked away for a very long time, and was now finally prying the door open. "I prefer things that hold together," she said at last, repeating her own words back to him. Caleb's gaze rested on her, and for the first time, there was something softer beneath its weight. "So do I." Word spread that the boy had been at fault, but it didn't stop the talk entirely. Some said Grace was too proud to have corrected the story herself. Others claimed Caleb had only defended her because his own honor was at stake. But in the quiet of the barn, with Juniper breathing easy, none of that mattered. Grace pushed herself to her feet, her shoulder protesting with a sharp stab of pain. She meant to leave, to retreat back into her silence, but Caleb moved, blocking her path. "Grace," he said, his voice low, "you've borne more silence than most ever could. I see that now." For a moment she let her eyes hold his, not yielding, not seeking, simply meeting. Then she moved past him, the lantern light brushing across her face, and he let her go. He stood there for a long time after she was gone, the echo of her quiet strength pressing into him like a brand. By late summer, Juniper was hobbling, her running days over, but her life saved. Grace continued to tend to her with unwavering patience, and Caleb started spending more time in the barn. He wouldn't say much, but he would watch. Sometimes he'd ask her opinion on grazing rotations or fence repairs. And he would listen. He would truly listen, in a way that made Grace feel as if she had been shouting into the wind her entire life, and had only just now been heard. Belle noticed the change on her next visit. She found Grace in the yard, sleeves rolled up, mending a bridle with her steady, neat stitches. Caleb was standing nearby, leaning against a fence post, asking her thoughts on the best way to drive the herd to higher pasture before the first snow. The ease between them was a quiet, solid thing. Belle's smile turned frosty at the edges. She snapped open her parasol, shielding her perfect skin from the sun. "Well, sister," she said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic, "it seems you found your place. How terribly dull it must be. All this talk of cattle and fences. A man like Mr. Del Toro surely deserves finer company, don't you think?" Caleb didn't even look at Belle. His eyes lifted from the bridle in Grace's hands. His tone was as flat and hard as the prairie itself, but it cut deeper than any insult. "I value her counsel." The words hung in the air, striking Bell silent. Grace didn't thank him. She didn't even smile. She simply looped the thread one last time and pulled it tight, her quiet strength a shield against her sister's venom. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. What had begun as a duty, a practical arrangement, had grown into something else. It had grown into respect. And respect, Grace knew, was a seed that could grow in the hardest of soils, just waiting for the first rain. Dust Haven kept on whispering. But out on the Blackthorn land, under the silent watch of Red Butte, something had irrevocably changed. Grace was no longer standing alone in her silence. Caleb had spoken. He hadn't spoken of love, or affection, or any of the things her mother prized. But he had spoken of value, and in the vast, lonely hush of the desert night, that was more than enough. Winter came down from the mountains that year like a wolf, lean and hungry. It came early, biting sharp and deep, turning the dry prairie into a desolate landscape of frost and frozen earth. The Blackthorn Ranch felt the cold in its bones. The cattle bawled at the frozen troughs, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The wind howled and fence posts snapped with a sound like pistol shots. Grace met the winter head-on. She was up before dawn, a heavy shawl wrapped tight around her hands stiff and aching as she broke the ice on the water buckets. Caleb rode the pastures from sunup to sundown, pushing the cattle into sheltered gullies, his coat so stiff with ice he could barely move when he returned. Their words remained few, but the rhythm between them was now steady, unspoken, like two people walking the same hard road, side by side. And then the fever came. It started as a simple chill that settled deep in Grace's bones. She ignored it, blaming the wind, the endless work. But by nightfall, her skin was on fire, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She tried to get out of bed and collapsed on the floor. Caleb found her there. The doctor was sent for, but a sudden blizzard had swept down, closing the roads, trapping Dust Haven in a wall of white. They were alone. Caleb never left her side. He pulled a chair up to the narrow bed and kept a vigil as the lamp burned low and the storm raged outside. His hands, calloused and rough from rains and rifles, were now impossibly gentle as he wrung out a cloth and laid it on her burning forehead. Every time she stirred, murmuring things that made no sense, he was there, his presence as solid and steady as the log walls of the house. Grace drifted on a sea of fever dreams. She called out for her father, her words tangling with half-remembered hymns. Caleb would lean close, his voice a low, even rumble. "You're here, Grace. Hold steady. You're not alone." The night stretched into an eternity. The wind shrieked and rattled the shutters. The lonely cry of a coyote echoed against the darkness. The house, once just a hollow space, was now filled with the sound of her labored breathing. Caleb, a man who had never been one for sermons, took the old family Bible and began to read. He read from the Old Testament, his tone slow and grounding, the ancient words a bulwark against the storm both outside and in. On the third night, the fever peaked. Her skin shone with a sheen of sweat. Her lips were cracked, and her voice was a bare whisper. In a moment of desperation, Caleb pressed his forehead against her small, work-roughened hand. He spoke her name, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, as if the syllables themselves could be an anchor to pull her back. "Grace, stay with me. You are stronger than this storm." She stirred, her eyelids fluttering. For a fleeting moment, her eyes opened, and she seemed to see him, really see him. Then she was gone again, pulled back under the waves. By dawn of the fifth day, the storm outside had broken. A thin, watery sunlight found its way through the window, laying a pale stripe across the floorboards. And inside, the fever broke too. Grace's breathing came slower, deeper. Her eyelids lifted, and this time, they stayed open. She looked directly into Caleb's face. He was slumped in the chair, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. But the moment her gaze met his, he was instantly alert, straightening up as if startled. "You're awake," he said, his voice rough with disuse. Grace swallowed, her throat painfully dry. You stayed. I wasn't going anywhere. She studied his face in the pale morning light, seeing the weariness carved into every line, the hard set of his jaw, and something else, the quiet, raw fear he had carried, alone, for 5 days and nights. A long moment passed in silence. Then her eyes closed again, not from fever this time, but from the simple, overwhelming need for rest. Caleb sat back, the breath leaving his body in a long, shuddering sigh, as if he'd been holding it for a week. He reached out, his hand hovering over her cheek, wanting to touch her, to reassure himself she was real. But then he pulled it back, as if afraid she might mistake the gesture for pity. Her recovery was slow. The strength returned to her, bit by bit. She spent her days wrapped in quilts, sitting by the window, watching the snow melt from the fence rails. Caleb moved through the house with a new quietness. He was still silent, but his eyes found her more often, a quick, assessing glance, as if he needed to constantly confirm she was still there. One evening, he thought she was asleep. He stood in the doorway of her room, his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. His words were a low murmur, spoken more to himself than to her. I thought I could build my life like a fortress, he said to the quiet room. Solid, safe, empty. But when you were sick, I found the walls didn't matter. They were just empty. I needed you inside them. He stopped, his jaw tight, and left before she could stir. But Grace had heard him. She turned her face toward the window, her heart beating an unsteady rhythm against her ribs, unsure if his words were a comfort or a new kind of burden. By the time the thaw came, the creek running fast and the mud thick on the cattle paths, Grace was nearly herself again. One morning she stepped out into the crisp yard and found Caleb saddling his horse. You shouldn't be out in the cold so soon, he said, his back to her. I've been still for too long. The work is waiting. He turned and studied her face for a long moment. Then, without a word, he handed her the reins to her own horse, already saddled and waiting. They walked the pasture together that morning, the silence between them no longer empty, but full. Their steps fell into a natural rhythm, as if the land itself were keeping time. That evening they had coffee at the same table. Grace poured. Caleb unfolded his ledger. Neither of them remarked on it, but the simple act changed the shape of the entire house. The fortress had begun to feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. Belle chose that week to visit, arriving with a basket of goods and a face painted with deep concern. But her eyes kept darting to Caleb, to the quiet, watchful way he stood near Grace. You still look so pale, sister, she cooed. It's a shame you have to bear such hardships. Some women just aren't meant for the strain of ranch life. Grace offered a faint, knowing smile. And some women are. Caleb, who had been standing by the fireplace, spoke without looking up. His tone was even, but the words were a clear warning. Grace has carried more than most. She will outlast this land itself. Belle's lips pressed into a thin, ugly line. She left before supper, her smile as brittle as a sheet of ice. That night, as the lanterns burned low, Caleb paused outside the small library where Grace sat reading. He walked in and placed a new quill pen on the desk beside her. Its shaft was bound with a simple, dark blue ribbon. No note, she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. Books and pens, he said, his voice low, speak for themselves. Grace traced the line of the ribbon with her finger, and for the first time since the fever, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet, solid weight of being truly and completely seen. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, a lonely sound. But inside, the Blackthorn house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt just faintly like a home. When spring finally broke over the territory, it was as if the land itself was taking a deep breath. The cottonwoods along the creek exploded in a riot of green, and the cattle grew fat on the new grass. The Blackthorn Ranch, once a place of stark silence, now had new sounds. The scrape of two chairs at a kitchen table, the low murmur of two voices planning the day. Grace had regained her full strength, but she moved with a new, deliberate care. Each morning she worked on the ledgers, her pencil scratching as she tallied calves and measured grain. And now Caleb sat with her. He'd lean over her shoulder, his presence a warm, solid weight beside her. "You'd pull them from the south pasture already?" he asked one morning, his finger tracing a line on her map. Grace tapped the column of figures. "If we graze it down to the dirt, the soil dies. Better to move them now and give the grass a chance to recover." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. He was silent for a long time. "That's sound," he said finally. It was the first time he'd asked for her judgment, and from that day on, the questions came more often. Questions about water rights, about repairing the fences, about trading with their neighbors. The respect between them had taken root, and Grace knew, better than anyone, that respect was the most fertile ground of all. They developed a language that had no words. One morning, Caleb found a small sprig of lavender, tied with a bit of twine, tucked inside his saddlebag. He never mentioned it, but he pressed the flower flat and kept it between the pages of his main ledger. A few nights later, Grace found a book on her chair, a volume on frontier botany she had mentioned admiring weeks ago in the general store. No note, no word, just left where she would find it. She touched the worn leather cover as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. The house was no longer silent, it was quiet. They drank coffee in a comfortable quiet. They read by lamplight in a shared quiet. And the smallest touch, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a plate, her fingers resting for a second on his sleeve as she tied his bandana, carried more weight than all the spoken vows in the world. But Dust Haven hadn't forgotten them, and Belle especially wasn't ready to let go. She visited more often, her ribbons brighter than ever, her laughter a sharp, jarring sound in the calm of the ranch. One evening she cornered Caleb by the barn, the lantern light glinting in her polished eyes. "You don't have to go through with this, you know," she whispered, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "A marriage like this, it can be undone. No one would blame you if you chose differently." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I made my choice." Belle stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the clean, hay-scented air. "Grace will never be enough for a man like you. She belongs to the ledgers and the shadows. You were meant for more." Before he could form a reply, the lantern light shifted. Grace had stepped out of the barn, a bucket of feed in her hands. She stopped, her eyes calm, her face unreadable in the flickering light. "Then let me be the shadow I was meant to be," she said, her voice even and clear. Belle froze, her practiced charm shattering like cheap glass. She stammered something, gathered her skirts, and practically fled from the yard without another word. Caleb looked at Grace then, really looked at her. He didn't see someone quiet or meek. He saw someone unyielding, someone stronger than the stone walls he had tried to build around his own heart. The days grew warmer. Together they started a small garden behind the house. Grace knelt in the rich, dark soil, her fingers gentle as she set the tiny seedlings. Caleb dug the heavier rows, but he found himself stopping often, just to watch her. He watched the way her hands moved with such care, as if she were guarding something precious. "You make this place feel alive," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "It was never dead," she said softly. "It was just waiting for someone to notice." He took a slow step forward, the porch boards creaking under his weight. He reached out and gently tucked the strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers, rough and calloused, lingered against her skin. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he were afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace between them. "I think I was, too," he murmured. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes, for the first time, showed him something she had always kept hidden. It was hope, a dangerous, steady, undeniable hope. That night at supper, Grace didn't take her usual seat at the far end of the long table. She sat down next to Caleb, so close that her skirt brushed against his leg. He turned, a question in his eyes. She answered it by laying her hand gently on top of his on the table. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I'm done being afraid for myself." He drew in a long, slow breath. His hand turned over, his fingers lacing with hers. He lifted her hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of duty, or pity, or passion. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of dry earth finally meeting rain. Grace didn't pull back. She yielded to it with a sense of profound relief, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this one moment. When they finally parted, they rested their foreheads together. His voice was low and rough with emotion. I should have chosen you with my heart, not with my head. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. You did, she whispered. You just didn't know it yet. The Blackthorn Ranch was transformed. The Hollow House was now filled with the small, quiet sounds of a shared life. Grace tied Caleb's bandana every morning, her fingers brushing against his jaw. He left a steaming cup of coffee for her on the porch rail at dawn. The neighbors noticed. The town noticed. The whispers changed. They no longer pitied Grace. They respected her. They spoke of her as Mrs. Blackthorn, the quiet sister who had steadied a broken man's heart. Some said she had taught him how to live without his walls. Others said he had finally learned to see the treasure that had been in front of him all along. But Grace and Caleb paid the whispers no mind. Their world was the ranch, the wide prairie, the shadow of Red Butte. One evening, as the sun set the sky on fire, they stood together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The land stretched out before them, vast and endless. But the center of their world was right here, in this small space between them. It was a love discovered late, but it was strong, and it was true. And for the first time in her life, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The rains came without warning, rolling in from the west in a wall of clouds as black as hammered iron. By sundown, Dust Haven was cowering under a bruised sky, lightning splitting the heavens and thunder shaking the very foundations of the earth. The Blackthorn Ranch braced for the onslaught as the wind tore at the shingles and rain turned the gravel yard into a rushing river. Grace stood under the narrow overhang of the porch, a lantern held high, its light feeble against the roaring darkness. She watched the water rise, carving new angry channels in the hard-packed earth. Then she heard it, the frantic pounding of hooves. Caleb appeared out of the deluge, soaked to the bone, his horse lathered and trembling. He swung down from the saddle, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "The south pasture is flooding," he shouted over the storm's fury. "The new calves are trapped against the wash." "I'll come with you," she said, her voice firm. "No, you're barely healed from the fever. It's too dangerous." His voice was sharp, not with anger, but with a raw, primal fear for her safety. Grace gripped the lantern tighter, her eyes locking with his, two steady points of light in the chaos. "They'll die if they're left there, and you can't drive them out alone in this." He hesitated for only a single agonized heartbeat. Then he gave one sharp nod. They rode out into the heart of the storm. The rain felt like needles against their skin, and their horses splashed through water that was rising with terrifying speed. The wash, normally a dry creek bed, was now a raging, muddy torrent. The cattle were bawling in panic, pushed up against a fence line that was threatening to give way. Caleb was off his horse in an instant, wading into the churning water, his voice a raw shout that was swallowed by the thunder. Grace was right beside him, her skirts heavy with mud and water, and together they pushed into the terrified herd, forcing a path through the flood. At one point, a panicked steer broke from the herd, its eyes rolling white. It charged, nearly sweeping Grace off her feet and into the deadly current. Caleb's hands shot out, his fingers closing around her arm like a band of steel. He yanked her clear, pulling her hard against his chest. For a split second, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the storm raging around them, his grip the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. Then they pushed forward again, side by side, until the last of the herd had stumbled onto higher ground. They were both soaked through, caked in mud, their lungs burning from exertion. Caleb pulled Grace up onto his horse behind him, and they rode back through the driving rain, their bodies pressed together for warmth against the biting cold. Back at the ranch, Grace slid from the horse, her body stiff, her face pale but fierce in the lantern light. Caleb caught her hand before she could turn to go inside. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice rough, a ragged mix of awe and anger. "Because I will not let you fight your battles alone," she answered simply. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't flinch. She lifted her chin. Now you tell me something, Caleb. Why did you really choose me? His jaw worked, rain dripping from his eyelashes. The carefully constructed walls he had lived behind for so long finally crumbled into dust. Because you felt safe, he admitted, the words torn from him. I thought you would ask nothing of me. I thought if I had nothing to give, I could never be hurt again. And now, she whispered. He let out a long breath, as if he were shedding the weight of a lifetime. Now I see that safety wasn't what I needed. I needed someone who wouldn't run away when the walls came down. Someone I could trust with all of it. The land, the fear, the heart of it all. Grace, I see it now. You were never the safe choice. You were the brave one. Her eyes glistened in the stormy light. She stepped closer, her cold hand resting flat against his chest, over his heart. I never wanted to be your duty, Caleb. I wanted to be the place you came home to. Something broke inside him then. Not weakness, but a final, complete surrender to the truth he had been running from for so long. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently brushing the rain from her cheek. He bent his head and kissed her, a slow, certain kiss that was a vow spoken without a single word. Grace met his kiss, steady and unafraid, as if she had been born for this storm, for this man, for this moment. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet mesquite. The ranch was battered, fences broken, pastures scarred, but the house stood strong, and inside it, something new and unbreakable had been forged in the heart of the storm. Neighbors rode out from Dust Haven to help with the mending, their talk buzzing with the story of what they'd heard. Caleb and Grace Del Toro, riding into the flood together, saving the herd side by side. The town's whispers finally died, replaced by a quiet, solid respect. Belle did not come. Her name, once on everyone's lips, began to fade like a forgotten song. The weeks passed. The ranch settled back into its rhythm, but it was a new rhythm. It was the rhythm of two voices planning the day, of two pairs of boots walking the fence line together, their steps perfectly in time. The Blackthorn house was no longer hollow. It was filled with Grace's quiet presence, with her books on the table, with the low, rare sound of her laughter. And Caleb, the man of guarded silences, now found words came easier, especially when they were spoken to her. Not many words, but the ones that mattered. One night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Caleb stood up from his desk. He walked over to where Grace sat, closing her ledger for the day. He braced his hands on the arms of her chair, leaning over her. I married you out of fear, he said, his voice low and intense. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of giving my heart to someone who would break it. I thought if I chose someone who asked for nothing, I could never lose everything. Grace looked up at him, her eyes steady. And now? His voice softened, broke. Now I know I was a fool. You are not nothing, Grace. You are everything. I don't want a house without you in it. I don't want this land unless you are at the heart of it. Her own voice trembled, though her gaze did not. Then stop being afraid. This is my home. I have no wish to leave. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and breathed the words he had carried, unspoken for so long. I love you, Grace. Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was tender and true. And I love you, Caleb. From that day on, the ranch grew. It grew not just with cattle and crops, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of two people bound by more than duty, more than respect. They were bound by a love that had been tested by whispers and storms, by sickness and silence, a love that had not only survived, but had triumphed. One evening, as the setting sun spilled gold across the land, they stood together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and vast. But they no longer felt small in its presence. Their world, once hollow and lonely, was now full. It was here between them, as steady and true as the turning of the seasons. And it was more than enough. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. Your support means the world to me. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep bringing you more stories just like this one.